everyone, Donne here, and today I want to talk about how things are going in the industry right now, especially the YA industry, the kid lit industry, since as always that is definitely my area of expertise. How are things going related to COVID? Are things better? Is it a good time to query? How's submission? Are things basically still on fire? Yeah, they definitely are. It's almost worse. Well, it's definitely a topic du jour. So Jennifer Laughran did a Tumblr post on this yesterday or the day before, and it's blown up a little bit. It's bringing up the conversation of why is everything so slow right now in publishing? Like, what is going on? And she laid it out, and I was like, ah yes, it is maybe time to talk about this. You guys have been asking since I did my video last summer. Last August, I basically did a touch base on like the ways that COVID was impacting publishing and why at that particular period in time I advised that August, September last year wasn't the best time to query for a variety of reasons, but that it would open up again. And it did, and it has, but I've definitely noticed patterns, especially recently as we are getting back to normal, that indicate that we're not really back to normal, but more that the new normal seems to be real bad. In terms of volume, overload, burnout with agents, editors, it's impacting authors, and generally, if you are new to the channel, hi, welcome. I like to talk pretty candidly about what goes on as an author and in the publishing industry, and if you are not new, you know that we've talked about a lot of trends we've been seeing. Market saturation for YA, period. YA as a category has been saturating, is saturated. We are seeing changes. Death of the mid list, shifts there, generally across the board. There's more authors than ever and more books being published and more agents than ever, or people calling themselves agents, but publishing houses are actually getting smaller. We're seeing mergers, which leads to cuts, consolidation, all the bad things that can come when you have like mergers and monopolies. Advances are down. It's harder than ever to make money off of being an author. Sales are down across the board. For a lot of books, not all books, which we will kind of talk about. It's never been a better time to be a bestseller, and it's never been a worse time to be anyone else. And I know you're going like, it's all bad. Why? Get it, honestly, get the beverage of your choice if you are already stressed out by this introduction, whatever that means. Drink responsibly. Cause yeah, we're gonna talk about Jennifer Laughran's post and kind of what's going on, and yeah. And as always, I'm going to have timestamps down below because you know I'm going to talk a lot, and you know there's a lot to digest here. It's going to help you jump around, including if you were just here to hear what are the trends? What is selling? I got that overwhelmingly as a question more than any other question because I did ask you guys if you had questions on this topic. And so I am going to go over things I've seen, things I've heard industry professionals talk about, my personal opinions and observations. None of it scientific. So there will be timestamps down below if you want to skip all of my blather before that. So starting with Jennifer Laughran's post. I won't read out the whole thing, but I'm going to give you some highlights, putting a little bit on the screen. Someone asked, what is with publishing being so slow? You'd think with the pandemic ending that this would pick up. And Jennifer, it's really great. She walks you through the timeline of the pandemic and publishing and kind of the escalating impacts of these things. You know, she talks about, you know, first the book fairs were canceled and everyone realizes that they'll be working from home, and traditional publishing largely wasn't and isn't set up for work from home, remote. So many things about publishing, like you need to be in the office. It's a lot of physical stuff. Paper shortages that already exist, printers that went out of business because of COVID. All of those things are in here. It's an escalation. She talks about how so many people in publishing are parents, especially women who work in publishing, who then had to do majority of the at-home childcare on top of also managing to do their job. And that also, jobs that were also already kind of full throttle take-home jobs, like agents in particular, but editors too. There's a lot of burnout in publishing because it's a job that you don't really have on hours and off hours. You do it all the time. You take it home with you. It's really typical for anyone working in publishing who has to read as part of their job to do all the job stuff, all the other stuff during work hours, traditional work hours. But then all the rest of the time they're reading constantly. A lot of people in publishing, I experienced this as a reader too, you might have as well, some epic reading slumps during the pandemic. Epic reading slumps are just kind of what people want to read and are able to actually get through, changing attention spans. Hot mess. So she walks through it. She talks about things being pushed, backlog, and she talks about how there's more work since all this happened, not less. Agents, editors, etc. have more work than ever, more hours to fill. There's just everyone's mental health is in the garbage can. They're both catching up, but also I'm gonna talk about like the number of emails people are getting and the number of submissions. So she goes through all of that. I'm gonna link down below for you to read. Really good post. And I'm also gonna link to the Twitter thread because there are lots of good responses to that. Also some very bad responses. Like, it's never a good look to basically say like, well, if I could do XYZ during the pandemic, why are you so bad at your job? Let's just not play the oppression Olympics at this juncture. But lots of editors and agents chiming in saying, thank you. Yes, this is my experience as well. It's been so hard. There are agents on this thread who shared that people they love died. So many people are dealing with aspects of grief. And you know, I've talked about grief and writing on this channel. It can like, grief generally and trauma, well, it's like it pokes your brain full of holes, and it's actually not that simple to kind of recover from. And generally that we're seeing, not just in publishing, the pandemic is having long-term and very serious effects on a lot of people and our mental health. So all of this discussion is going on. And one tweet crossed my attention this morning, actually from my previous editor from HMH. She laid out her email volume before the pandemic versus during and after the pandemic. This will give you a view to what editors have been experiencing on the editor and submission side, and agents are also reporting the same increase in volume of emails and things that they have to pay attention to, submissions essentially. In 2018, she received 14,048 emails. In 2019, she received 16,230 emails. Then in 2020, 20,216 emails. I imagine part of this is the effect of the pandemic. When you switch to remote working, you have to do a lot more digital communication, but we've also heard that subs are up across the board, and I'm going to talk more about that. You know, it wouldn't be like a publishing video without me warning you about schmagents. We're gonna talk about it. And it is now the beginning of July, and she's already received 14,136 emails. She's only halfway through the year. So if you want to know why editors are stressed and overwhelmed and why sub is a nightmare and it's taking forever, that is why. So the state of publishing, let's just talk about the status quo, because the big question, other than like what's trending, what can move in publishing, is should I query? Is now a good time to query? Or I know many authors who are on submission, suffering on submission, and they're miserable, and you know, they're looking for resources. And I even have some on this channel like talking about submission, but I don't think you can compare or talk about submission 2 years ago or more to now. You're not imagining it. It's a hellscape. It's worse than it's been in a long time. I checked in with my agent about this. I've talked to friends who are agents and editors, and they're all reporting the same thing, which is everyone's overwhelmed, everyone's burnt out, everyone is behind, everyone feels guilty about this. Submissions are out of control. Query volume is up, and then submission volume is up. We've seen a huge trend. I've talked about this before in other videos here and there, but there was a massive trend during the pandemic as everyone is stuck at home, as many people have, you know, had financial hardship. Very understandable, but is that really the time for you to basically style yourself as a schmagent? I mean, the people who do never know that they're schmagents. So most people don't set out to scam, but we've seen a huge uptick in new agents and agencies starting up who have no business being agents or agencies, who have no actual connection to the publishing industry. So they really have no way to actually get their foot in the door or sell books, but dagnabbit, they exist now, and they are also sending dozens of submissions to editors. So on the editor piece, I'm going to talk about this sub thing because it does trickle down to queries, and then I'm going to talk about the querying piece. So there's actually something related to this that popped up in March that I guess I could have made a video about before, but I'm making it now. We're talking about it now. Like, industry stuff has been brewing and developing for a while, but it's something that legitimately blew my mind. And I guess it blew my mind because it also blew my agent's mind because she was part of this conversation on Twitter. Well, so first Eryn Murphy, a very well-respected literary agent, tweeted that she heard that an editor that she knew had gotten 12 submissions in a single day, and she was marveling over this, and it kicked off a really interesting conversation on Twitter. Some editors weighing in, some agents. This is a trend across the board, and apparently, like, because what context do we have for what is normal with editors, for what's normal with submissions? Well, apparently 12 submissions in a single day is very, very high. That is abnormal. But all the editors are weighing in that, yeah, volume is just up. Some editors receive hundreds, or can receive hundreds of submissions a week. That's bonkers. And this led to, so my agent, this is something I did know, because my agent had shared this with me and I'd heard it from other places. There is an increased trend, professional trend, that wasn't the case in the past, of editors ghosting on submissions. It wasn't that widespread before, and it was happening before the pandemic, but it's gotten markedly worse since the pandemic, enough so that my agent like pointed out to me, I know when we went on submission the first time, out of 14 editors, we had 1 ghost. I don't remember ghosts on subsequent rounds, but I remember at the time, and that was 2017, my agent said it was very, very unusual to have an agent who, after multiple nudges over a period of months, just flat out never responded. Apparently that is now a new norm. Not for all editors, don't fret, but for a lot of them, because editors are so overwhelmed by submissions that sometimes all they can do is just not respond. And I'm honestly sympathetic. So I feel like, well, if you haven't been in this situation, bless you. I feel like we've all been in that situation where we're just overwhelmed by all the things, by all the responsibilities, by digital communication in particular. You're just getting email after email, all these demands on your attention and your time, and you just lose sight of things. And you're like, but then you get a follow-up, but then you get a follow-up, and you feel that flush of shame that you lost sight of the thing, and you think to yourself, okay, I'm gonna do the thing and then I'm gonna respond, and then you don't do it again. And then they follow up again, but at this point it's been like a ridiculous amount of time, and you're like, if I just pretend I didn't see it, I don't have to acknowledge that I have failed at the thing that I'm supposed to do. And it just becomes this horrific cycle. I still, like, mind you, after many years in professional business, acknowledging receipt is a magical thing. And in fairness, I think there are also editors who do acknowledge receipt and then still ghost on a submission. But this led to an interesting conversation and realization. It was a realization for my agent as well. Because the thing is, until you actually talk about what business norms are, you don't necessarily know what everyone else is doing, or you'll make assumptions that like one thing is business standard or industry standard, and then you find out other people feel differently. So we discovered that there are many different ways to pitch on submission, and I'll say that there's no one right or wrong way to pitch submission other than, you know, like bad agents, schmagents who shotgun, and so on mass submission. But some agents will do, some even do a phone call before, like a phone pitch. Some do an in-person pitch when that was possible. Some send like almost like their own query. So a proposal where they have the pitch and some sample pages, or just the pitch, and then the editor indicates interest and says, yes, I would like to read this, send me the full. Some agents just send the pitch and attach the full manuscript so that the editor doesn't have to ask for it. Now, my agent does sending a pitch and then she gets them to acknowledge and request. That is how we know within 48 to 72 hours how many editors on the sub list actually want to read the book and are reading it, and usually it's most of them. That's how my agent knows that her sub list is good. She targeted the right people. The book has now been added to their reading queue. And now I I assume the ones who send the full with the pitch package also go for an acknowledgement of receipt as well. But it's at least the way my agent does it, it's the idea of like, it's opt-in. You know, they make them go, yes, I want to read the thing, because that means that they can also say, oh no, this one isn't quite for me. And sometimes they do that, which enables my agent to move on to someone else, because if they reject it at the pitch level, often, sometimes it does vary depending on the situation, the imprint, and so on. But sometimes early in the game of submission, it does enable the agent to target someone else, say a different imprint at the same publisher, and so on. Whereas when that doesn't happen, editors will hold a submission hostage, and you're sitting there for months and months and months and months. You don't have a response. You don't know what the editor thinks, and so it lingers, and thus leads to all of authors in our pain, and agents feel that pain too. Well, my agent did a poll, and 70% of the respondents, though I think some people, because they tweeted in response, accidentally did it who weren't editors, but let's assume most of the responses are editors, 70% of them said they're fine with agents sending the pitch and the full at the same time. So clearly editors don't mind this at all. But what this leads to is, and this is part, they don't reject those, even if they get it and go, oh, I know this pitch isn't quite for me. They don't go back to the agent in a timely manner and say, I don't think this one's gonna work for me. Instead, all those books sit in a perpetual maybe pile for a long time, and we get to that whole hostage situation, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating for everyone, and that's not me laying blame on the editors. I think it's hard when you have full material to then go like, no, I don't like it at all. I think it's a psychology of like, well, I should give it a shot. Like, I have the pages, I have the full. And of course, as authors, we're like, oh, that's good that they could potentially give it a shot. But it leads us to this. It leads us to editors who have hundreds of manuscripts to read, some of which they have a gut impulse that they probably aren't going to be interested in, but instead of politely rejecting or sending a form rejection, they feel like, well, the agent sent me the full. It's my duty, it's like professional courtesy to read as much of it as I can and provide some sort of personalized rejection feedback. And there was debate going back and forth on Twitter of like, some people saying, well, I'd rather have like a quick form rejection if it moves things through submission than wait 6 months for a personalized rejection. And then of course there are other people who know they want the feedback. So the point here is that submission is a mess and it does trickle down to queries and whatnot. Things are more stressful and frustrating than ever for agents, trickling down from editors, but also a lot of the push from agents pushes back up to editors. Because another thing that is happening is there are different schools of thought on what are called multiple submissions. So many agents will only submit one project at a time to an editor so that they don't have multiple of their clients or similar ideas competing for the attention of that editor. Some agents will spam editors. So that's another thing contributing to this sub thing. There are some cases where there are agents, and in many cases it is maybe some of the schmagents who only know a small handful of editors, and so they'll send a dozen projects over the span of 6 weeks to the same editor. And that's the thing, editors just have more than ever to deal with and to look at. It's slower than ever. Submission is hell. So this portion is me basically explaining it to the people who find it interesting, but to those of you who are past that first stage, you have an agent, you are in submission hell, or you're about to go into submission hell. My advice to you is prepare. I'm basically seeing and have seen since like the beginning of the year, it literally only goes one of two ways. You either sell in 2 weeks or less in a crazy whirlwind, and I know multiple people that has happened to, or the opposite, you enter submission hell and it's slower than it's ever been. And it's full of all the feelings and it's torturous and awful, and I'm so sorry. You're not alone. I encourage you to find any groups you can find of people who are currently on submission. There's a lot of people out there band together, but it does get messy, and it kind of brings us now to querying and me getting a little bit salty because, again, as I've already indicated, one of the reasons submission is extra extra bad. I think it would be bad either way, but it's extra bad. There are more agents than ever calling themselves agents, more agents than ever who are desperate to get a sale because understandably, financially, things are really, really not great for a lot of people. We are not in a great situation. I'm sympathetic. However, as I said, this has led to a ton of people who have no business calling themselves agents. It's also led to many agents I've noticed doing more of a shotgun approach than maybe they would have in the past, meaning I'm seeing people sign loads and loads of clients because they're gonna do the spaghetti method if they don't already have robust client lists, because we're gonna talk about agents with established lists in a minute. Signing so many people, which inevitably when you think about that logically means, oh, if they just sign 20 clients over 3 months, they're gonna put a lot of those projects on submission in short order, which that is a single agent, and think of all the agents pumping out. Let's say they don't sub all of those projects right away, but like they might sub 10 to 15 of those in the next 3 months. That's a lot of volume because they're taking the spaghetti approach, for better or for worse. Not all agents who are signing up a bunch of clients to try to like hedge their bets are bad agents. A lot of them are actually then gonna end up selling a lot of projects. But in a lot of cases, so this brings us to what's querying like right now? Should you query? I hate being the bearer of bad news. Though the adage remains true. Is it a good time to query? Is it a bad time to query? Honestly, if you're ready to query. I'd say there's never a good time to query anymore or a bad time to query. It's just all kind of this bog that you have to wade into. Nothing has changed from last August in the sense of querying is very, very slow. It is slower now than it has been in the past. And as I said then, I'll say it again, you can't really judge what's normal in terms of timelines and response rates based on anyone who queried, say, prior to 2019. Not really. Things have changed a lot. And actually similar to submission, I find that it's feast or famine. You're either going to zip through the query trenches and be picked up fast, and there's a number of factors that go into that, or it's gonna take forever. Again, get your support systems, get your people. So again, conflicting advice. As I said last August, I stand by it. If you're even slightly not 100% sure that the manuscript that you have is in its best shape, slash that it can wait, if you really think it's like hot timing for something and you don't think waiting 3 months is going to make a difference, query. But if you are not in a rush, take the time to polish your work, because the trends I was seeing last year have not changed. In fact, they've gotten worse. If you are looking for established agents, top agents, agents who have decently crowded lists and you really want to be on those lists rather than with a newer agent, or again, we're going to come back to schmagents in a minute, you have to put your best work out there. And that's not just about polish, honestly. We are going to talk about trends. You have to like be like, this idea is hot. I have done like my best work in terms of like coming up with a high concept, making sure it's commercial, really getting like, make sure the character arcs sing, like putting your best foot forward. Cause I'll tell you, a lot of those big agents that you want to be represented by, if they're not closed to queries, and a lot of them are because pandemic, overwhelmed, etc., they're just very rarely taking on new clients. Part of the reason for this, other than things are overwhelming, especially with the narrowing of YA in particular, challenges in the mid list and so on, a lot of those agents are, they're focusing on the clients that they have. A lot of those clients need a lot of work and care to sell more projects, to get over career humps, to make sure everything's going well for them with the books that are coming out. And when your bandwidth is limited because everything is on fire and everything is bad, many agents are doing what they need to do, which is they're concentrating on the list that they have, the authors who are already making them money, and they're just not able to take on a ton of new clients. It doesn't mean they take on no new clients, but it does, like, you know, it's all about odds, it's all about statistics. Which means, so overwhelmingly, because, you know, I know a lot of people who are querying through a lot of different channels, the fastest responders, the most positive responders right now, like the people who are making offers, are definitely newer and hungrier agents. And this brings me back to my favorite topic of schmagents. So my general advice that I think I gave last year, but if I didn't, I'm giving it to you now. Strategically, the smartest thing you can possibly do is make sure that your query list is not top heavy, that it is not a majority of like the biggest, most famous agent at X agency. You should really smartly and strategically look at those great agencies, those big agencies that you know can sell in a tough market. Don't query the most famous person there. Look for the newer agents, look for the hungrier agents. A lot of agencies have taken on new agents, especially being more flexible with remote work, though we're gonna come back to that as well when I do a little Q&A. Those agents are hungrier. Those are the names I'm hearing come up over and over again as like, oh, I got an offer from so-and-so. Oh, someone just signed with so-and-so. Those are the agents that you need to be looking at. But again, the biggest trend that is concerning me is that rise in just mediocre meh agents. They are also ones who are making a lot of offers. And look, on TLXO moment, you know that I can talk until I'm blue in the face about red flags for agents who aren't particularly good, how it represents a risk when you go with an agent who is not only new, but maybe doesn't have the best experience or set up their own agency with middling experience elsewhere. That hasn't changed. I don't like that you query them. I really wish you wouldn't, but I also don't blame you. It is really, really hard when you're querying sucks and you put your heart into a book and you do your best to do your research and put together a really good list and you're querying, but querying is slower than ever. More agents than ever are non-responders to query. You feel like you're shouting into the ether and you query the ones that you really, really want, but they're not answering or they reject you, and you kind of get deeper and deeper and deeper into a list and you query more agents, and it's this, you don't want to give up on your book. And so very often it's the human thing, honestly, to make some poor decisions, to query people maybe you shouldn't, because we all want to hope and hinge on the idea of like, well, you know, there are yellow flags. Let's call them yellow flags, even if I think they're red flags, but I'm being generous. But it could turn out great, and sometimes it does. Sometimes I'm wrong. I know you're like really, really shocked. I'd say like 95% of the time when I have had my eye on a schmagent, I do turn out to be correct, but sometimes someone really exceeds my expectations and I'm genuinely happy for them. And that's really great for their clients. And so we all are like, it could work out. So I'm not mad at you, but it hurts me because the next trend on the horizon or the thing that's contributing to it's not the reason for all of these problems. These problems already existed, but it exacerbates them and it hurts a lot of you. The thing that we're gonna see, and it's a cycle, and I had already seen like earlier in the pandemic and slightly pre-pandemic people signing with a lot of these agents. So these are the authors who are now languishing on sub, who are suffering on submission and think that it's them and think that they're alone. So it's gonna take 2 to 3 years for it all to catch up. We have and will have a massive volume of hopeful, aspiring authors who get agented by agents who can't sell their books. A whole crop who in 2 to 3 years are gonna be back in the aspiring author pool and the querying author pool because it didn't work out there, or they'll cling to that agent who can't do anything for them far longer than I would like. They're gonna end up cycling through books, wasting books, lots of disappointment, and those submissions contribute to this horrific volume with editors. It hurts me inside as ever, which I guess we're gonna talk about trends, I promise, which kind of brings me to like, because the question does come up like, well, if you realize that you're in a situation where your agent isn't very good or your agent can't sell your book or you think you made a mistake or just frankly, because this is a separate issue, we're mostly talking about writers on the earlier ends, but I see this happening with a lot of mid-career authors as well. It's not a good fit with their agent anymore and they need to go back out in the trenches. I still firmly believe, I said this in my what to do if you want to leave your agent video. Leave your agent if you need to leave your agent. It's always the right decision if you're miserable. But my warning then is it's really bad out there, and the potential increases of you either not finding another agent, at least not for maybe the project that you're on, or ending up signing with someone who maybe isn't the agent that you wanted, the caliber of agent that you wanted, and essentially like settling. It all makes me sad. But these are the trends that I'm seeing. The state of publishing, at least certainly in YA, that essentially as kidlit in particular, it is simply harder to sell it. It is harder to sell it. It is harder to stay in. It's the wheat separating from the chaff in terms of agents. I've said this before, and so I'm just saying it again. Please protect yourself. It is truly better to have no agent than a bad agent. But again, I'm not mad at you if you do that. I just hope that you don't. And it has a lot of impacts, including up into sub, where like, yeah, technically your agent can put you on submission, but with everything happening with editors and how impacted they are and how overwhelmed they are, you really don't have a snowball's chance in hell of really getting read and selling anyway. And yeah. But reminder, I don't say any of this to discourage you, I swear. It really is just so you could equip yourself. My advice stands that I've given before. This is the time to be as sharp as humanly possible about your project choices, about your writing, really paying attention to the market, making sure that you are firing on all cylinders. And again, if your heart is not in YA, don't write YA. YA is not the place to be right now if you want publishing to be easy or predictable. Adult and middle grade, and I know less about picture books, have their own unique challenges. Do not get me wrong, they are not some magical wonderland. But kidlit and YA in particular, we're in a transition. Yeah. Because the connection to sub is like, here's, good agents are still getting answers on sub. Their projects are still getting read on sub. It is harder than ever to sell than it has been in the past, and it might be slower, but it really just matters more than ever who you sign with. But a lot of those agents who you want to sign with aren't taking on new clients, or they're taking them on less frequently, or they're doing less YA. So just be as circumspect as you possibly can be. Look for the new and hungry, but pay really close attention to their publishing experience, where they're landed, who they're being mentored by, etc. It's gonna be okay. Now let's talk about trends. Disclaimer before I jump into trends. What is selling? What is not selling? Some of this is my opinion. I'm gonna tell you when I'm wildly speculating. Well, it's like a gut feeling sometimes. Some of this is based on actual like things I have heard from industry professionals who you would trust, agents and editors alike, in terms of like what is and isn't selling. But as always, none of this is prescriptive. So often, like, editors and agents, like, it's like they don't know what they want until they see it, though sometimes they do know what they don't want. But so the first thing is, you might have heard rumblings of this, but now is not the time to write YA fantasy. YA fantasy is incredibly saturated. It is challenging to break out a YA fantasy. Now, YA fantasy is still selling. It has never stopped selling, but it's saturated. We're seeing a lot that on the agent end, especially, agents just aren't adding a lot of new fantasy writers to their lists. Some of them still are, but not at the same volume as certainly like, oh gosh, like 4 years ago, like YA fantasy was almost like a ticket to getting an agent in some cases, and in some cases that's how you got your 6-figure book deal. It's just not like that anymore. And I mean like fantasy, I'm gonna like, contemporary fantasy falls under the fantasy umbrella, obviously, but I have some thoughts there. But like, I have heard from multiple professionals. I've heard it from authors who've gone on sub with fantasies and who have shared what their rejections have said. I have heard that from editors who like fantasy but are having trouble acquiring it or finding the right fantasy. I've heard it from agents. That is just across the board. And specifically what you hear is that fantasy just isn't working unless it's really fresh. They want something new, something different. Definitely not quiet. It also has to be commercial. Now, this isn't to discourage anyone marginalized who is like, God, I'm writing fantasy and now you're telling me that fantasy is dead. It's not dead. Fantasy will never die. Actually, in many cases, the fresh take, the fresh perspective that agents and editors are looking for is a fantasy written in a way that it hasn't been written before in YA from fresh new voices. It can also just mean like taking a new angle, like giving a new high concept to like a popular fantasy trope. We're gonna talk about romance. It can be going hard on the romance. You just have to find a way to be fresh, which I know is like such a vague term. And it's definitely not the time for anything that's like too kind of like quiet or fancy. Anything where you struggle to like really give an elevator pitch, you're probably gonna struggle right now in YA fantasy. It's just, The things that are getting through are hyper commercial and very pitchable, if that makes sense. But the thing about contemporary fantasy is that I'm seeing definitely more contemporary fantasy, the things where if like you like winked, you could maybe call it urban fantasy, wink, even some things with a hint of paranormal to them. We're definitely seeing that more than say high fantasy right now. Rom-coms are definitely still selling. It's still definitely that trend from the pandemic of like people want light escapist books, which I think is part of the lean toward things that are fast-paced and commercial, by the way, because it doesn't just have to be light. Thrillers are also doing well, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But rom-coms are saturating because for the last year, publishing has been buying a lot of them. So it's more important than ever to ensure that your rom-com has a very high concept. So again, it needs to be really, really pitchable to stand out from all of the other rom-coms that have been acquired and are coming out. Another trend I will say, this isn't necessarily going to help querying writers so much as writers who are kind of already in the pipeline, already agented, etc., maybe mid-list, you've been published. There's also been a big rise in IP rom-coms. So a lot of publishers are either developing rom-coms in-house or they're acquiring rom-coms from packagers. So those can be opportunities for you to look for if rom-com is your thing. Generally speaking, I'm always going to stand for romance. I still believe like if you have something and you're kind of struggling to make it as commercial or as high concept, adding like a really juicy romance thread, I think that's always going to help a YA book sell, which doesn't mean that YA books have to have romance. That's actually been a really great evolution of YA. A lot of YA books don't have romance or focus more on friendship or focus more on the adventure. And in fact, like we have so many more Arrow Ace books and there's definitely more space for those books. But if you are inclined toward romance and you are working on say a fantasy with a romance thread, you can never go wrong dialing that up, or you know, we just talked about rom-coms. Now thriller, suspense, horror, mystery. This one's really, really tricky. Obviously I write YA thriller and I'm seeing success with YA thriller. Yeah, YA thrillers are definitely on the rise. We got a bunch coming out this summer. Bunch came out in the spring. Karen McManus continues to sell bonkers copies, but thrillers are a really tricky space. And if you are already committed to and writing these books and you were doing all that work, great. Actually, I'm just gonna sound like a broken record. The thing is, it's gotta be high concept. It's gotta be pitchable. Cause I know a lot of people who write thrillers and some are selling easily, so to speak, and some just aren't. Quiet is the last thing you want to be in the thriller, horror, suspense, mystery space. Hard to pitch, or a pitch that sounds too similar to other books that exist. And we are limited in the YA space in terms of the tropes that kind of work for thriller, mystery, suspense, horror books. So thrillers are technically booming, but it's actually really, really hard to write one that is going to work and get you an agent and sell. So meaning if you're sitting there going, what should I write that's gonna sell? Like, don't just like do thrillers because you think that's gonna work. They're deceptively hard to write. It's harder than you think to come up with a pitch that hasn't been done a million times before, is gonna have that fresh factor. She says currently trying to think like, what the heck am I gonna write next? It's really, really hard. So like technically trend-wise, those are definitely doing well, but it's tricky, and I see it heading towards saturation as well, which brings me to a mini trend of dark academia. Yes, this is definitely a mini trend that we're seeing. No, the Ivies is not a dark academia, but it has kind of been swept up in the dark academia like boom that we're seeing. So we're definitely gonna see more boarding school like suspense books bunch out this summer. I see a lot of people doing those as their option books or their next contract books. Some on sub, some that are selling. There is definitely a window to sell dark academia. We've seen some titles announced. I think there's room for some more, but that's gonna saturate fast. So my advice there is if you already have it, query. Make sure it's tight and firing on all cylinders and query it, but don't start writing one now because I honestly don't think you're gonna be able to sell one a year or two from now, because I think all those are gonna have come out or be coming out. Could be wrong, but it feels like a mini trend to me. And And then generally just a note on horror. This is a gut feeling one. I feel like we're gonna see some more horror-ish thriller suspense. I mean, they're gonna call them thrillers, which is a whole other conversation. Even if they're really horror, I do think we're gonna see more horror-ish things. The tricky thing is that there are not as many agents, certainly in YA, who rep YA horror, but if you can write one that appeals to the small handful that do, we do see them selling. And then also there's things like the Get Other Lines line, which is a paperback line at Random House under like related to Delacorte. They do more like pulpy thrillers and horror, and they also have some rom-coms that they acquire. Those are really good options, especially for submitting on proposal, which again isn't so much for debuts, but can be good for mid-career authors. That's definitely a space they're publishing titles like that. The next thing that like I see as something that can definitely work, but again, like it's hard to aim toward this. I think anything that's like upmarket that can be pitched for any of the book clubs, something like Reese's book club, can do well. These are kind of like unicorn type books, but like anything like The Firekeeper's Daughter that walks that perfect line between being a little bit literary, a little bit smart and important book club worthy, but eminently readable and hooky and high concept. There's a sweet spot there for those books. Because especially these book clubs are very powerful marketing tools, and so publishers are looking for things that can be chosen by Reese's book club or the Barnes & Noble book club and so on. So if you have something that fits that sweet spot, I think there's a moment for those types of titles. And that spans a lot of different genres, because the book clubs, they'll pick suspense books, they'll pick romance books, they'll pick more like straight up contemporary books and so on. Every once in a while they'll pick a fantasy as well. Sci-fi is still sci-fi, I'm sad to tell you. It's still technically like just, it's sci-fi. I have a whole video on that, and I checked with a couple people. The landscape really hasn't changed from anything I've said before. However, this is where we get into like pure speculation opinions. I don't know, like my gut says like that there's some room there. I want to believe it. Like I feel like if I firmly believe and hope that there's room for like the next sci-fi, something fresh, something that is maybe straddling sci-fi in another genre. And I really hope we have another mini trend. We haven't had one in a bit, so I want to believe that sci-fi can have another moment. So do with that what you will. Graphic novels. Graphic novels are huge. They're on the rise. The tricky thing is most of us don't write graphic novels, don't know how to write graphic novels, and aren't in that space. But if you are, now is the time. There aren't a ton of agents in the YA space who do graphic novels, but those who do, find them. Query them. I asked my friend about it because I noticed this trend in the deal announcements, a huge rise in graphic novels. A lot of publishers are doing them. A few of them have imprints just for graphic novels, YA graphic novels I mean, and middle grade graphic novels as well. And if you are a writer only, you would sub a full script. So you would be writing a full script for a graphic novel and querying that. But if you are an author illustrator, apparently you can, or a pair, like you have like a co-person, you can be subbed on proposal for a graphic novel. So, but that said, I just got that advice from someone, but I don't know a ton about how to query a YA graphic novel, so there's separate research for that. But if you are already in that space or feel even halfway inclined to figure out how to do a YA graphic novel, those are on the rise. Middle grade. I talked to my agent about this one, plus another friend, plus my own speculation. So it is still technically a pretty good space to be in. It's definitely easier in some ways than YA, but middle grade is much like those rom-coms, is definitely approaching saturation because so many people have jumped over to middle grade. A lot of great new books in kind of process and publication. My agent said that anything like adventure-y, like questy, high stakes, high concept commercial, still pretty easy to sell. I've also personally seen a trend of like whimsical, magical middle grade, but anything that's more like straight contemporary or more on the quiet side, not impossible, but definitely a little bit more challenging. So like middle grade, I mean, really this should be the advice with anything you write. You should write the things that you really love to write, but like don't jump to middle grade because you think it's easier, because it's about to get harder. So only do that if you're really, really committed. And then with adult, again, as always, you know, I have limited experience with adult, and I can't speak to adult fantasy. I saw some questions on Reddit like, is adult fantasy saturated like YA? I don't know. If you are in that space and you know, comment down below. But I can say about adult romance is doing very, very well. And in particular, the trend that I have seen, other than high concept, because high concept is always really, really good, and also a lot of YA writers fleeing to that space, is traditional romance is getting so much better, like Big Five and major publishers at publishing queer adult romance. So there's a lot of opportunity there, as well as I'm genuinely curious. So TikTok is like the last thing, but related to this, with like the whole Ice Planet Barbarians thing, I'm wondering if we're gonna see that ripple to traditional publishing. So maybe some like outside the box adult romance will sell. And generally, I'm very curious to see how TikTok impacts the industry, impacts queering, and impacts sub, because I do feel like every publisher is looking for the next book that can blow up on TikTok. So if you can be comped to like a TikTok sensation, I feel like that can only help you. Which brings us to a little bit of Q&A. I asked on my community tab, like, what questions do you have for a video like this? Got some good ones. Mostly people wanted to know the trends, so now you know all of my opinions and a couple of well-founded bits of information on that. But the first question I thought was a good angle on it, which is, what kind of books slash tropes slash genres do you think agents slash editors are not willing to take a chance on? In other words, what is a harder sell? What is out of vogue? So I covered the trend side, but the pat answer to this, I think anything quiet are not things that agents slash editors are willing to take a chance on. Quiet slash anything with a poor sales history. So that impacts more authors who have already had books out. It's always been the case that poor sales on earlier books can impact your ability to sell going forward. But if that is a problem that you have, it is more important than ever to come out with the most commercial, like aggressively commercial high concept thing you can, because publishers, you know, they're always slightly risk averse, but I'm seeing especially now they're just not willing to take a chance on quiet books most of the time now, like quiet books slash niche genres that are less commercial. Doesn't mean that quiet books cannot get published, it's just a lot harder, and it's also going to be down to agent style and agent taste on the querying side, because there are still agents who will sign something because they love it, and it doesn't matter if it's quiet, and they're gonna like throw their heart and soul and time behind that book, and they're willing to ride it out. But certainly any more commercially minded agents, obviously, but especially like sharkier agents who just really right now have to concentrate on like they need to sell books, they're just gonna be less able to take on those projects. So the next question is, I would like to hear what you have to say about publishing new adult books. I'm writing a coming of age story that is set in college, and I've heard that new adult is a dead genre. So will it be difficult to publish this story? So I have made a video on this, things have not changed. New adult is not a thing in traditional publishing. Dead category still has its place in indie publishing for sure, but traditional publishing has never gotten behind it. Asterisk. What they've done instead is expanded YA. We are seeing more and more YA books that are on that upper end. I don't mean ACOTAR, which has finally been reclassified as an adult book, as it should be, but in a good way. We're seeing more and more announcements for books and books that are published that are set in college or kind of college adjacent. There's a little bit more wiggle room now at the top end of the YA category to have books like that. So my advice is to query it as an upper YA. You can just call it YA in your query, or YA with crossover potential is another nice way to put it, but be very, very aware of what those upper YAs, YA crossover potential books that push up a bit actually are, and what they do versus new adult in indie publishing. You need to be thinking more like Fangirl or Emergency Contact, and a lot less after. You're not gonna have the explicit like sexual coming of age stories still in traditional YA publishing necessarily. Never say never, but definitely kind of frame it that way. Is remote work going to remain a viable option for publishing professionals, such that it makes it easier for those who can't move to New York to become publishing professionals? I know there are quite a few agents who work remotely, but until the pandemic, it wasn't so common for editors or other publishing house employees. This is a really good question. I have a very depressing answer. A lot of this is more like my opinion slash speculation, but I can tell you what I've observed and what I've heard, and also from my perspective coming from television, which is an adjacent media industry. Everyone wants to go back to the office. And by everyone, I mean the corporations, not the employees. Publishing especially is kind of a dinosaur. It was not prepared for the pandemic. It was not prepared for remote work. They kind of found their way. Still haven't quite figured it out on the marketing and publicity side. That's not a knock to them. It's really hard to market books when you can't do anything in person and do those traditional modes of promotion. But what I'm hearing is that nothing's really going to change. And I did a quick scan of recent job postings on Publishers Marketplace. They are all still based in New York or whatever city the publishers are based in. And the few of them said like remote until we can return to the office, so you must be physically located in the tri-state area. But most of them didn't say it all because it says location. New York. It is not going to change, especially for entry-level positions, especially for anyone who's going to be new to a company. It is easier to acclimate and train someone into a position in person. It is easier to do a lot of kinds of work in an office. This is definitely true of TV. While we've more or less coped, I've more or less coped doing our job and my particular team on the TV side, we're not going to go back to 100% office. But our industry, Hollywood, has every intention of letting most people, or making most people, go back to working in an office at least a good chunk of the time. We have better remote work tools, which is going to be helpful for more senior positions or once you have your foot in. I do think publishing is going to be more flexible on that. They already had a bit of that flexibility. Like once you had established yourself in New York, as we know, that's how we do get agents, including mine, who do not live in New York. They lived in New York for a while, but then they were able to move somewhere else and they have no problem doing their jobs, not being physically in an office, being physically in New York. I think that there will be hopefully more flexible work options for editors and publicists and whatnot, people who don't necessarily physically need to be in the office to do their job. But I do think it will probably still be necessary to have some physical proximity to where companies are physically located. They're gonna make you come in for team meetings. They might do 2 days a week in the office, 3 days not in the office. And so unfortunately, I think that there's gonna continue to be gatekeeping essentially that is rooted in classism, that it is rooted in ableism. It has issues of ableism and accessibility in the publishing industry. But I also think it'll be case-by-case basis. I think we're going to see some publishers and some agencies who are going to be more flexible going forward. So I do hope there are more opportunities, but I honestly don't expect that the industry is going to change. I think they are waiting to go back to normal as soon as they can, because it is honestly easier to run your business when you have a physical office and your employees all come to the same place and so on. I mean, there are pros and cons. I will admit I am someone who doesn't mind going into the office and having access to the copier and the mailroom and being able to do those aspects of her job. I basically haven't been able to do anything related to any of that in a year and a half, and so there are aspects of my job that are infinitely harder or that we just can't do or haven't been able to do for a year and a half that we're going to go back to doing, and I think publishing is the same. I mean, literally no one can physically mail out ARCs, or it's a real big hassle to physically mail out ARCs, or they couldn't when no one was in the office. So like there are literal mechanisms of publishing that have to happen in an office, and publishing continues to be based in New York. But seriously, I am hopeful that there's at least more flexibility and that select agencies and publishing companies are a lot more open to giving people opportunities, even if they don't live in New York. And the last big question was, the big question is the same as last time, is now a bad time to query? I think literally right now, the month of July might be a bad time to query. And that's anecdotal and that's purely my opinion, and we'll see if August is the same like it was last summer, only because things are opening up again. The pandemic's not over, but for right now in this exact moment, people can actually go out and see their loved ones and do things and travel. And I know a ton of people in my personal circles as well as professional circles who are taking vacation left, right, and center. So July potentially is not a great month to query, but honestly, because querying is so slow, again, if you're ready to go, you might as well, because if you weren't going to hear from an agent for 8 weeks anyway, you might as well query now and get yourself in the queue. It's up to you, but generally the answer is I don't think there's any definitive good time to query right now, and so you just kind of have to feel it out, base it on, are all the agents I want to query open? A lot of agents are closed this summer, and kind of gauge it that way. Generally speaking, if you decide that it's a bad time to query, I say no one should sit for more than 8 weeks on a project that is ready to go because it's a bad time to query, because then it'll never be a good time to query. And generally speaking, while sub is kind of a nightmare right now and everything's slow and everything is in flux, publishing does continue on. People have to sign clients and people have to buy books. We haven't seen a ton of announcements for 2023, 2024 lists and seasons, which means those books have to sell. And so I imagine we'll see spikes in the fall going into next spring, meaning I assume fall and spring seasons will continue to be decently strong times for both query trenches and submission trenches. It's just kind of like, it's the feast or famine thing. So, and especially if any of the things I mentioned that are still doing kind of well, or that I think there's a mini trend, query now as long as you're ready. But it's rough out there. I hope you're okay. Self-care, very, very important. Do whatever brings you joy after watching this incredibly depressing video, but I hope informative. The thing is, nothing I've said, I hope none of it's a shock, because it's really how it was 6 months ago, 8 months ago as well. And things always change. I do think the new status quo is that things are going to be slow and harder for a long time. I think that the burnout and the effects of this are going to last for a really long time, also because the pandemic technically isn't over, because of all the like stops and starts of like the challenges of work from home and the challenges with childcare and school, and just like recovering from the burnout and finding the joy of reading and finding the time and going back to the office and all that thing. I think this is going to have impacts on publishing for a while, and so we just have to keep on keeping on. Let me know down below in the comments any more questions that you have about this, any rays of hope you can provide, or things that you can confirm. And give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more long discussion style videos about topics in traditional publishing. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.